Start the share the screen now?
Yeah. Don't need to be looking at me, they can look at you if they like. Morning everybody, and thank you all for joining us. So today's talk is Nutrition for Irish Dancers. I'm Roisin Cahalan, and I, with Scott Murphy, lead the Complete Irish Dancer project, and I'm sure most of you are aware of that, and we do regular talks on different facets of health and performance in Irish dancing. So I'll get you to move on a slide there, Catherine. So today we're joined by Dr Catherine Norton. Catherine is a colleague of mine at the University of Limerick. I'm going to let her explain more about herself in a second, but just to give you a little bit of context, I suppose, nutrition and diet are hugely important in any activity, Irish dancing, of course, as much as anything else. But it's probably one of the things that we struggle with more. We don't know as much about it as we do maybe, you know, the importance of injury and injury prevention and all the things that we can do to manage our injury and our performance. It is challenging in Irish dancing. We all know about long feis days in places that aren't really equipped for nutritious food. We know about early morning starts. We know about late evening classes, and trying to get a good, healthy, balanced diet to help us optimize performance, to help our body repair and regenerate and grow. And, you know, that has implications for performance, obviously. So there's a little bit of research out there, and we'll talk about that in a second. So some of the things we're going to talk about today and are basically what we do know. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the research that is there in Irish dancing, and there's not very much in dance generally. Then Catherine is going to talk about a bunch of different areas. So she's going to talk about appropriate loading. Well, you can talk about what you are going to talk about in a second, but some of the areas that we discussed were things like, you know, recovery, hydration, supplements, and all the other pearls of wisdom that Catherine is going to deposit and supply to you as we go on. So if we move on there, Catherine, what we know so far. So there's basically been one project done in Irish dancers. And that was done at the University of Limerick, and that was done a couple of years ago by Jasmine Chalice, and that's Jasmine's picture there. And I wanted to flag her up because she has done a lot of work with myself and with other members of the Complete Dancer Project, and also she really has discovered the only bit of information that we have. So she's an accredited nutritionist and dance dietitian on UK Sport and Exercise Nutrition Register. So she's from the UK, but she's worked with dance students and teachers and professionals for more than 25 years. So other genres of dance, contemporary dance and ballet dance. And she was involved in the One Dance UK roadshows, and that went around the country in Britain giving talks and workshops on nutrition and dance performance. So she's very, very highly esteemed in the dance world, and we were delighted that she had this interest to investigate Irish dancers. So just to give you a couple of the main findings that she discovered from her pilot work. So she did a study of, they were adult Irish dancers. So they were people who were studying Irish dance at the University of Limerick, people who were full-time or predominantly professional dancers or elite competitive dancers, but they were over 18. And she spoke to about 40 of these individuals. So the first thing she did was to find out about their knowledge about nutrition and diet. So there's a study or a questionnaire that asks about people's knowledge about, or to classify foodstuffs into various categories. So whether it's high, low in carbohydrates or fat or proteins. And we as Irish dancers scored worse than pretty much any other cohort that has been investigated apart from business students. So we were particularly poor at identifying what foodstuffs were high and low in fat in particular. She also looked at body composition in dancers. So she looked at their body mass index measured by DEXA. So that's a machine that will allow the investigator to look not only at their overall weight, but the proportions of muscle and fat. Am I correct in saying that, Catherine?
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah.
So it was normal for most, but there was higher body fat in some females as opposed to other dancers. Now I wouldn't necessarily be more concerned about that because the dancers, some ballet dancers in particular, would have very low body fat, but just interesting to know. What was a little bit worrying was the dietary practices. So Jasmine asked the dancers to fill in food diaries, so record everything they ate and drank for 4 days consecutively. So there was a weekend day and 3 weekdays. And we really did quite poorly in terms of taking in the correct things that we should be eating and drinking. So we were low on energy, fiber, we were low in females for their iron intake, which is a really important substance for females. Magnesium, selenium, iodine. Catherine, you know more about this, but they're all important things that we should be taking in. so we were taking less than the recommended values for lots of different things, and particularly fruit and veg. We had very low intake. Some days would have no fruit and veg portions at all. So that was really interesting. So we don't know very much about the foods that should be eating, and we don't practice. We don't have good habits in terms of what we eat either. So that's all disturbing. There was also a small number of dancers that had indicators of disordered eating, and they were given appropriate direction to resources to support those dancers. Now, you know, this is only pilot work. It's only one small group, but that's all we have for now. So it's just an indication. So we'll move on there, Catherine. So on that, I'm going to pass you over to Catherine. So I'm really delighted that Catherine here. She's one of my most esteemed and impressive colleagues at the University of Limerick. She's done a huge amount and worked with all sorts of professional teams and worked in health and worked in industry. Catherine, I'm going to ask you to talk a little bit about yourself and then to go from there. So thank you very, very sincerely for doing this for us. I know you're extremely busy, so thanks again.
Great, thanks Roisin. Good morning everybody. I'm delighted to have an opportunity to speak to you. As Roisin indicated there, I have over a 20-year career in nutrition and dietetics, and my base qualification would be in health, so registered as a dietitian. And in the last 15 years or so, I suppose I've spent more of my time working in professional sport, predominantly in both rugby. I worked with Munster Rugby as head of performance nutrition for 4 years, and I also consult across boxing. It has been professional dance, whether it's ballet or contemporary or Irish dancing. And oftentimes people, particularly in a high performance environment, underestimate the demands that dancers put on themselves and what's required for the training that they do. So I'm going to give you some quite high level information. As Roisin alluded to earlier on, it isn't possible to give prescriptive, individualized information when I don't know any of the backgrounds to the kinds of issues or concerns that you may have. So this is quite generic, but at the end I'm going to guide you towards resources and websites where you can find professionals with similar qualifications to mine if you felt that it would be beneficial to consult with a performance nutritionist. So as Roisin had mentioned, if you want to put any questions in the chat bar, I'll be able to see them at the end, or I'm happy as well to take any questions when we finish up. So often there's a misconception about sport and exercise nutrition, and people think that it's forget about the things that you do on a day-to-day basis and go straight in with the performance aspect of it. The foundation of any appropriate nutrition plan for performance has to consider healthy eating and the requirements for growth, for health and development before you overlay that with the requirement for training and performance. And the concept of the 24/7 athlete is not supposed to be one that is intimidating or to insinuate that athletes, whether you're dancers or rugby players or anything else, are consumed with food and that it's 24/7 switched on regarding what you're eating. But there is a certain level of professionalism, which is described by the whole concept of being a 24/7 athlete, which infers that you're considering your nutrition not just on the days of a feis or the days of a high stakes competition or an event, but that you're considerate of what you're eating all of the time. And this really speaks to the idea of performance nutrition being nutrition for health, the nutrition that's required in order to support training, recovery from training, physiological adaptation and development, and then also the nutrition that's required in order to compete well or to perform well on any given day or any given event. And oftentimes people are surprised to hear that I describe this in the context of a cake. So sprinkles are the bits that people are always very interested in, the creatines, the supplements, the beta-alanines, and those are the very last things that we consider when it comes to the hierarchy of performance nutrition. Icing is good, and icing would speak to what you do before, during and after training, but the cake is probably the most important part, the base ingredients as to what you eat on a day-to-day basis. So we're going to move through nutrition for health, nutrition for training, and nutrition for competition and performance. And when you put it all together, then ideally you should have the perfect synergy of all of those individual macro and micronutrients and energy balance to ensure that you perform to the best of your abilities. So we're going to start by looking at energy balance and move upwards then towards the different micro and macronutrients that might be required to support training and competition. And we'll finish off with a small bit on supplements, and I'll point you to some resources that I feel might be useful if you're looking for additional information. Energy balance there isn't really anything too complex to it. If you consider weighing scales and you're considering the energy that you put in and the energy that you expend on a day-to-day basis. So the energy that you put in is going to be in the foods that you consume and the drinks that you consume, and the energy that you expend is in your activities of daily living, but more importantly in the context of sports and performance, the physical activity that you have in training and in competition and in performances. So one of the easiest things to do is, if you consider the two parallel lines that I have on this chart here, from when you wake up in the morning until you go to bed in the evening, what I'd like you to try and consider, or if you have a pen and paper beside you, is if you could map over the course of a day what your energy demands are. And oftentimes, particularly in athletic context, people consider their energy demands as I am training, but they might neglect that they have an active commute to get in and out to college, or that they coach underage soccer, or whatever it is. You also could have cognitive demands in that if you're studying all day, or if you have a job that's quite demanding in terms of your cognitive or emotional fueling, you need to consider those as well. So when I consider what my fueling might look like on a daily basis, this line that you can see across those two parallel bars is supposed to indicate where my highest energy demands are. I have 3 young kids, so when I wake up in the morning, I'm switched on straight away trying to get them up and ready and out the door. Equally, I have an active commute to and from work. I do some training in the evenings occasionally. So that might be what my energy expenditure looks like. The obvious next consideration would be to try and consider where you put your fuel in. So if your fueling strategy is at odds with where your fueling demands are, it means that you're either trying to perform in an under-fueled environment, or that you're trying to recover from something which had a high energy expenditure without the appropriate nutrition. So if you consider what my energy expenditure and energy intake might look like, my energy demands are not met by the times that I fuel. This can be because you're not sure, and if we look at the research that Jasmine has already completed, it could be that because dancers as a cohort don't have that knowledge around what they should be eating and when they should be eating it. It could be just that you're getting it wrong, that you may be well-intentioned, but that you're eating the wrong foods at the wrong times. So the first step is to look at the energy demands that you have on any given day, not just for physical activity, over the course of the whole day, cognitive, emotional, physical, and then see where you input energy. And if you can see that there's a large mismatch between when you fuel and when you expend energy, that's the first thing that you need to address. And as soon as you've identified what your energy mismatches are, the obvious next questions are, what should you be eating? When should you be eating? And are there different strategies that you need to put in place around the times that you train or that you compete? So we're going to look at these in a little bit of detail over the next number of slides. I mentioned a while ago the concept of a 24/7 athlete, and again, to reiterate, this isn't supposed to have a scary connotation of somebody who is consumed and obsessed with the way that they eat. It's very well acknowledged in the literature that if you consider yourself to be on a diet or to be following a restrictive eating plan, that it's easy to fall off the wagon. So there is no such thing as foods that are prohibited, limited, restricted in the sense that you can never have them. In food for health, as well as in food for nutrition and for performance and for training, the concept of an 80-20 rule is the most useful and probably the one that athletes and the general public find the easiest to follow. And this speaks to foods that are necessary and foods that are nice. So if you consider the foods that are necessary as being those that have the energy that you require, but more importantly, the micro and macronutrients that you require for growth, for health and development. So these would be fruits and vegetables, whole grains, low-fat dairy products, and proteins, which would be meat, fish, chicken, eggs, cheese, or peas, beans, and lentils for anyone who may be vegan or vegetarian. So these are the foods that provide nutrients in high volumes and not too many calories. Whereas the foods that we would recommend that you try and keep to a lesser amount, not that you restrict completely or that you avoid, but that you keep to a lesser quantity in your diet, are the foods that generally have a higher calorie content, but a lower nutrient density. So they have fats, carbohydrates, some proteins, but very poor in things like the nutrients that Roisin outlined at the beginning, which have been already reported as being of concern for dancers in particular. Now you can either consider your 80-20 in a I'll be good Monday to Friday, or I'll look at what I'm doing for most of the meals in the day and I'll always have a cheat meal. But probably a better way to go about it is to consider it in terms of a plate. So if we consider that this is a plate model whereby you're trying to ensure that you have 80% of the foods on your plate that are providing nutritious, beneficial, nutrient-dense foods, and 20% of the foods on your plate could then provide nutrients that don't have the same quality. And if you look at it in terms of the plate, you can see that there's almost a peace sign on your plate whereby 3/4 of your food is taken up with carbohydrates and 1/4 is protein. And again, to reiterate, the proteins would be peas, beans, lentils, meat, fish, chicken, eggs, cheese, and lower non-fat dairy. Your carbohydrates then should be divided into 2 separate groups, one being fruit, vegetables, and salads, and the other breads, breakfast cereals, potatoes, rices, and pastas. The one that you should focus on, and particularly in an Irish context, the ones which we probably eat too much of, would be the breads, breakfast cereals, potatoes, rices, and pastas. They go on our plate first, generally in Ireland. What I'm suggesting is that you consider putting your fruit, veg, and your salad and your protein component on your plate first, and then consider looking at your energy demands and see, what are my energy demands for this meal? Do I require a high or a low proportion of those carbohydrate-rich foods which provide energy to fuel predominantly physical activity? So if you're able to say to yourself, yes, I have a dancing session this afternoon that's going to be 2-3 hours long, 90 minutes, whatever it is, I require a large proportion of whole grain complex carbohydrates to fuel that. Put it on your plate. But if you're saying, no, I'm a student and I'm going to be sitting in the library, my demands will just be cognitive and I probably don't need to have 3 potatoes and 2 slices of bread, then load your plate with more of the fruit, veg, and salads rather than the complex carbohydrates. I'll come back to this later on and I'll try and show you, looking at different meal plans, how you put it into practice. The other logical way to try and check and see whether your food strategy is supportive of your energy demands is to see, is it supporting the body composition goals that you've had that Roisin alluded to? Is your body mass, your body weight where you'd like it to be? And proportionately, is your composition of lean mass or muscle relative to your fat mass in the regions that you'd like it to be? Another method of checking in to see whether your food and fueling strategy matches your requirements is to ask yourself, are you hungry? So I think a lot of people are familiar with a popular chocolate bar. I have an ad on the television whereby somebody who is very hungry becomes hangry and behaves like a diva. What we're trying to ensure when it comes to checking in with yourself using hunger as a tool to try and ensure that you're eating the right amounts is that you stay in the green zone. You should never have the, I'm so hungry I could eat the legs on the table feeling, but equally you should never have that Christmas Day, open your top button, food coma feeling. So you're aiming to stay within the 4, 5, 6 zones whereby you're getting hungry, you're feeling neutral, or you're mostly satisfied. And this really necessitates one thing that I mentioned on a previous slide, eating little and often. Rather than having large meals infrequently, it should be meal, snack, meal, snack, meal, snack. And that should help to stay within the green zones that I've identified on this slide here. So that kind of covers the basics on how to ensure that you're consuming the right volumes of food, the kinds of foods that you should be aiming to have on your plate in an 80-20 or in that peace sign model, and checking in with yourself to see, are your nutrition strategies supportive of your body composition and body mass goals, and how does it make you feel? I'm going to move on now to address something that is really undervalued as a nutrition strategy when it comes to performance. I think dancers actually may be ahead of the curve when it comes to this, because more often when I'm interacting with dancers, I see that generally they are carrying bottles of water and flasks with them, which is very reassuring to see. One of the leading experts internationally on hydration and performance would always open his presentations by saying, if I could give you a supplement that was free, widely available, had no risks associated with it, but had the potential to improve performance by as much as 30%, would you be interested? And of course, everybody says yes. And then he goes on to say that, well, it's water, it's just hydration, and everybody has access to it, but it's often overlooked. So what I'm showing you on this graph here is how on the bottom graph where it says percent dehydration, if you're dehydrated, you can see on the vertical side of that chart that your performance can drop by as much as 70%. Now, when you're 5% dehydrated, you have already felt the sensations of thirst as in a dry mouth and that you feel you need something to drink. But your performance can be impacted even at 2% dehydrated, where those triggers or those nudges towards taking fluids on board aren't even available to you yet. And your performance can have a decrement by as much as 10% without you even realizing that thirst might be a factor. So there are lots of strategies that large position statement bodies have around drinking a yogurt carton amount every 15-20 minutes, using fingers to say, I'll have 3 fingers or 4 fingers of fluid every 15 minutes. Really the guidance is to ensure that you drink to thirst in order to ensure that your performance is not affected. And one of the easiest ways for you to analyze this or to check in with it yourself is using hydration charts. These are available to download from the internet and you can print them off. Just make sure that your printer doesn't give you any indication that you're poorly or well hydrated. Make sure that you have adequate ink in your printer if you're printing these off. You can also buy them from a lot of sports nutrition resources. And this hydration chart aims to identify what color your urine should be first thing in the morning. The easiest assessment of hydration status is your first pass urine. So when you wake up in the morning and your first urine that you pass, it should be pale in color, large in volume, and not very strong smelling. So ideally you should be in 1, 2, or 3, and that indicates that you're well hydrated. If you, over a period of time, realize that you have a low urinary output, so you don't pee a huge amount, and when you do use the bathroom, that your urine is very dark in color or very strong smelling, that's the best indicator to you that you are not taking on enough fluids. And straight away, consider the decrement to your performance that might be impacted by having a low fluid intake. So consider revising the way that you use hydration to improve your performance. So we're moving on now with that. We've dealt with the cake, the basic nutrition for every day, for general healthy eating guidelines, and for hydration. And we're moving on now to the icing part. So the icing part speaks specifically to the training that you're doing and how to fuel that training most appropriately. This could be a whole podcast series on its own, and I have some resources included at the back that can guide you towards the best evidence-based research when it comes to what to eat. But the most important question to ask yourself is, what training am I doing? And what is the physiological adaptation that should arise from that training? Because the fueling strategies that you will put in place should differ dependent on whether your session is focusing on strength, conditioning, endurance, skill acquisition. So dependent on what it is you're trying to achieve, you should put a different strategy in place. A strength program requires protein, and the timing and the amount of the protein that you should consume after a strength program is identified at the end of this slide kit. If it's an endurance or if it's a conditioning session to try and improve your overall aerobic capacity, your fueling strategies are different again. So again, as Roisin mentioned, this is beyond the breadth and scope of this introductory session, but I do have resources at the back that can point you towards where you can find this information. But the take-home message from fueling for training is, know the training that you're doing, personalize the nutrition strategy to the intent of the training. And if you feel that you need more help with this, consult with the registered sport and exercise nutritionist or registered dietitian to help you to identify what fueling strategies you require for different training sessions. The recovery from Irish dance or any other physical activity is not just after the end of a feis. If you've been at a feis for 6 or 8 hours in a day, or if you've been dancing for 3 hours in a class, there is another aspect of recovery which is termed active recovery, and this is particularly important for physical activity that has repeated bouts or heats and qualification stages to it, as dancing would have. It's very important that you ensure that you recover adequately in between these bouts and sessions, as well as in between discrete training events or competitive events. I hope that makes sense, that I'm asking you to consider each event that you dance in as a discrete physical activity demand that you need to recover from. And when it comes to recovery, there are 4 R's that need to be considered: refuel, repair, rehydrate, and relax. The relax and repair we'll leave alone, but the refuel and hydrate would speak to the previous slide that I had, where I was saying, consider the event that you've done, consider the demands that you've had and the energy expenditure requirements that you've had, and fuel most appropriately for that, whether it's carbohydrate, most likely on the day of a feis or competition. It could be protein if you're looking at a strength and conditioning program. Rehydration, extremely important, and not just water. So when you're considering rehydration, don't forget that if you have a high perspiration rate, that you're not only losing water, but you're also losing salts in your sweat and electrolytes. So in some instances, it may be necessary to consider rehydration solutions, particularly if you're competing under lights and it's a very hot, warm environment, and if you've got costumes or clothing that are quite heavy. And it might also be worthwhile considering refueling and rehydrating in one fell swoop, whereby you would have a solution that contains carbohydrate, salts or electrolytes, and fluid. And sports drinks are a good one size fits all for those. Oftentimes people find that they need to water those down and have 2/3 to 1/3 in a ratio of the rehydration solution to water. But this is something that you can practice in training to ensure that you get it right on event days. One of the groups of athletes that I've dealt with quite a lot would be swimmers. And I was struck by, when I was speaking to Roshan earlier on, the similarities between a feis and a swim gala. They're both day-long events. Generally, they have poor nutrition available to them. It might be vending machines. There are very seldom canteens or cafeterias available. So you're really at the mercy of your own kit bag. Now, this can have good and negative connotations. So if it's up to you to bring your own food and nutrition strategies with you, that's something that you can control. And that can give you a sense of control and one-upmanship over your competitors. If you know that you've ticked the boxes for nutrition, you've adequately packed your nutrition kit bag so that you have fluids, carbohydrates, proteins, all of the foods that you require, you can feel a sense of security that you've got something in your arsenal that other people may not have. And I've identified here some things that in a swim context, we would often suggest that young athletes would bring with them. So if you come back to what I was speaking earlier on about that plate model, where I was saying that each meal or eating occasion should have proteins, carbohydrates, and the carbohydrates are split into two sources, your fruit, veg, and salad, and your whole meal or whole grain carbohydrates. What I've tried to do here is include a protein and a carbohydrate source that are easy to put in your kit bag. This is completely down to personal preference. As long as you have a representation from a protein containing food and both a complex and a simple carbohydrate in each of these meals, that's all that you need. So plan in advance, scope out the event location. If there's no food there, plan your kit bag and bring it with you. I have more resources at the end of this slide that point you to where you can get additional tips and additional suggestions as to what kit bag essentials you could bring with you. So one of the final pieces that I wanted to discuss was supplements, and I'm aware that dancers are probably no different to any other athletes, and this is the bit where everyone goes, okay, this is the good part, this is the important part, this will give me an edge. This really is only worth considering once you have your cake and your icing under control. So if you haven't addressed your nutrition for every day, your hydration practices for every day, and if you don't have a nutrition plan in place that supports growth, health, and development, putting in strategies to support training and also putting in strategies that are the icing on the cake and the sprinkles on the cake, the supplements are really, they're not really of any huge benefit at all. Don't forget the hierarchy of everyday training competition. So there are some supplements that are worth considering, particularly if you have a diagnosed deficiency in any particular nutrient. So they would be things like multivits that address if you have an iron deficiency, a calcium, or any other micronutrient deficiency. That would need to be discussed with a practitioner or your own primary care physician. Sports supplements worth considering should only be considered if you speak with your dance instructor and if you have a strength and conditioning coach who you work with in terms of strength conditioning and endurance training. And there are some which are worth considering, but it is important to stress that these are only worth considering if you have all of the other aspects of nutrition under control. There are some resources, again, at the end of the slide kit that I will refer you to that give you more information on what kinds of supplements in what situations might be beneficial. Supplements are only indicated for over 18s and should only be used in consultation with a suitably qualified practitioner. So these next few slides that I have go through breakfast, lunch, and dinner. I'm not going to dwell on them in any huge detail, but they identify, as I had already pointed out, a protein, a whole meal carbohydrate, and a fruit, veg, or salad source for each of the meals in the day. And they're just supposed to give you some indication as to how you could meal plan, both in terms of general health, but also in terms of events. So this would be for breakfast, whereby you've got your proteins, your eggs, your bacon, or your yogurts, your carbohydrates as your porridge, your meal, your bagels, or your toast, and then your fruit, veg, and salads. Similarly for lunch, there's some options outlined here. And also then for your main evening meals. I'm more than happy for these slide kits to be made available as a PDF for anyone who requires them, because there are some more resources that might be useful at the back. Similarly for snacks, these are the similar snacks to what I have for your kit bag essentials. The tendency among athletes is to consider protein, carbohydrates, and fruit, veg, and salad for your main meals, but to overlook them when it comes to snacks. It is important that you include protein sources at snack occasions as well as at your main meals. So there are some options for that here. There are plenty of resources available for general health and also for athletic populations. The ones that I've listed here are from both an Irish jurisdiction and also from the Australian Institute of Sport, who have generally been leading the way in sport and exercise nutrition for the last decade. The Irish Nutrition Dietetic Institute, or in Australia or the States or any other jurisdictions, the dietetic institutes will always have a register of suitably qualified practitioners for nutrition for health. You can also then look to the sports disciplines for nutrition for sports and training. These two booklets are PDFs that are available online, a sports nutrition handbook, fueling wisely for sport and exercise, and also Fuel Your Body strategies for young athletes. These are available freely online, and I think it would be very beneficial for you to download those and have them in your kit bag for reference. The final slides I'm going to let you look through in your own time. They go through some of the key findings and the key evidence-based practices that are recommended for sport and exercise nutrition. Something that I mentioned earlier on about protein and strength training, the amounts and when you should consume them. Also around carbohydrates and endurance training, and how to vary the amount of carbohydrate that you're consuming day to day depending on what your physical energy expenditure is. How to fuel appropriately for a pre-event meal, how to ensure that you practice these things in training and not to leave it to competition days. And how to avoid gastrointestinal distress. This is oftentimes something that people have issues with, particularly if you're nervous as well. So hopefully those resources will be of benefit to you. Roisin, I'm going to hand back over to you. You have some more information here that you might want to speak to. As I mentioned a while ago, I'm more than happy to address any questions that you have either in the chat bar if we want to unmute and discuss it that way.
Thanks, Catherine. That was absolutely phenomenal. I've made loads of notes for my normal self. I'm delighted that I get to eat more during the day, even if it's much healthier than I'm currently doing. That was absolutely phenomenal. And I think the resources are really important as well, particularly the one around anxiety and nerves. I think that is a big problem for a lot of dancers, that they'll do everything else right. You know, they'll have everything, all the boxes ticked, and then they won't eat the morning of the competition because they're nervous. And if you don't have petrol in the tank, you're doing yourself such a disservice. And I always say that this is such a huge component, and I'm delighted to have you on and speak about it, because I think the information that you've given will be of huge benefit to people. I also think the few points you made about using sports drinks and then practicing your loading strategies and doing those, not leaving them to the competition day to do them, because you don't know what kind of adverse effects they'll have on your body on the day, but to practice them and see what works well with yourself is really important. There's just so much there. I think you've addressed lots of really important things. Has anybody got any questions? I know that you're probably all taking that in. I know Natalie has asked about the PDF. If anybody just contacts me on the Complete Dancer Facebook page, I will send you on the PDF, and I'll post this video as well on our YouTube channel, and I'll put a link up to that on the Facebook site as well. In the meantime, has anybody any specific questions? It was fantastic. I was texting a few people while you were talking there, Catherine, and the response has been like brilliant. It's just great to get that in such a succinct, direct format that points us to so many really useful tips. So
and I think that's what I was aiming to do, because you know, in 30 minutes, even in 3 hours, it's very hard to give this is everything that you need to know as a high performance athlete, because dancers are high performance athletes. But hopefully the resources that I provided would give you a foundation as to where you can start. And then if you feel that it's appropriate to have more interactions and engagements with sport and exercise nutritionists, there are also resources as to where you can find appropriately qualified people.
Fantastic. Nobody is popping up with anything, so we'll probably finish it up there.
Okay.
Guys, will you please share this with the Irish dancing community? You know, as much as we can do to get good practices and to optimize health and performance, I think it's really, I know you want to keep these tips for yourself because they're going to give you the edge, but let's be gracious and share the information. Catherine, sincerely thank you again. Absolutely phenomenal, and loads of really pertinent and useful advice that I think will really add to people's performance and their health. Part of it is being a better dancer, but part of it is having, you know, a good, healthy, enjoyable career with lots of longevity that you can dance for as long as you want it, to the highest ability, without pains, aches, damage, all the things that we avoid. So thank you very much, and thank you to everybody for joining us this morning, and please share it with your friends. Lots of comments there about great information, fantastic presentation. So Catherine, thanks a million.
Thank you. Best of luck to everybody.
See you all next time. Okay.